Good evening, all, and welcome back to Dark Fears. Tonight, we travel into the frozen heart and forgotten corners of Canada, through isolated small towns, endless wilderness, and places where help does not reach, to uncover 7 of the most disturbing, real, and terrifying small-town horror stories ever recorded. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Dark Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of Canada, where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Ethan Clark, and this happened when I was 27 years old. During the winter, I moved to Pine Ridge, a small logging town in northern Canada that most maps barely acknowledge. I took the job because I needed the money, and because Pine Ridge promised isolation. After a divorce and a quiet breakdown I didn't tell anyone about, isolation felt like safety. The town had fewer than 400 people, 1 gas station, 1 diner, 1 rule everyone followed without saying it out loud. No one stayed outside after dark. I noticed it my first night there. At exactly 6:12 p.m., doors shut, curtains closed, the streets emptied like something invisible had been announced. When I asked my landlord, a thin man named Robert Hale, why the town slept so early, he didn't answer right away. He just looked past me, toward the tree line, and said, "You'll hear it soon enough." That night, as the wind pressed against my windows, I heard something else. A low, steady whistling, drifting in from the forest. It sounded like it was looking for me. The whistling didn't stop. It didn't grow louder either. It stayed at the same calm, patient volume, like whoever was making it knew I was listening. I stood frozen beside the window, watching my breath fog the glass, telling myself it was just wind slipping through the trees. But wind doesn't pause. Wind doesn't repeat the same slow, deliberate tune. The next morning, I asked around town. At the diner, an elderly woman named Margaret stopped stirring her coffee when I mentioned the sound. Her knuckles went white around the spoon. "You heard it already?" she asked quietly. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Whatever you do, don't answer it. And don't follow it. It learns." That word stuck with me. Learns. When I pressed her for more, Robert appeared behind the counter as if summoned. He placed a plate in front of me a little too hard and said, "Some things keep Pine Ridge small." That night, the whistling returned. Closer this time. And for the first time, it sounded like it was coming from inside the town, not the forest. The third night was when I made my first mistake. I told myself I was imagining patterns that weren't there, that isolation was playing tricks on my mind. Still, I left a lamp on and sat on the edge of my bed, listening. The whistling came again at exactly 6:12 p.m., steady and measured, drifting between buildings like it knew every shortcut. Then it changed. For the first time, the sound broke rhythm and stumbled, almost like it was correcting itself. I realized with a sick twist in my stomach that it was copying something. Me? The way I'd absent-mindedly whistled while unpacking boxes earlier that day. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't loud. It was intimate, as if it existed inside my head. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek through the curtains, I saw something standing under the streetlight across from my house. It had a man's shape, but it stood too still, and it was facing my window. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the thing outside moving closer, step by careful step. Morning came like a weak apology. When I stepped outside, there were no footprints in the snow, not even my own from the night before. It was as if the street, had never been touched. Later that day, I found Robert standing by the edge of town, staring into the trees. I asked him how many people had left Pine Ridge in the last 10 years. He laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Left?" he said. "People don't leave. They get practiced on." He finally told me the truth, or at least his version. The whistling wasn't a warning. It was a test. Whatever lived in the forest learned voices, habits, routines. Once it learned you well enough, it stopped whistling. That was how you knew it was ready. As the sun dipped below the trees that evening, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I can do your voice now." I stared at that message until the screen dimmed. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too badly to type anything coherent. I told myself it was a prank, some sick local joke meant to scare newcomers. But deep down, I knew better. Pine Ridge didn't joke about its rules. That evening, I packed a bag. Not neatly, desperately. Clothes, documents, whatever I could grab. I planned to leave before sunset, but my car wouldn't start. The engine turned once, twice, then died with a sound that felt final. When I stepped out to check the hood, the air felt wrong, thick like the town was holding its breath. Then the whistling began again. Not from the forest, not from the street, from behind me. It matched my tone perfectly now. Same pauses, same pitch. I didn't turn around. I ran back inside and locked every door, every window. The whistling followed, circling the house slowly, patiently, as if it already knew the layout. And then it spoke, using my voice, to say my name. I collapsed against the door, gasping, listening to my own voice whispering outside, soft, reassuring, wrong. It told me everything would be okay if I just came out. It told me it was cold. It told me it needed help. That was when I understood how Pine Ridge survived. The creature didn't just hunt, it replaced. It learned you until the town couldn't tell the difference. Maybe that was why no one ever left. Maybe no one ever truly stayed either. Hours passed. The whistling faded. When dawn finally arrived, there was a knock at my door. I didn't answer. I watched through the peephole as Robert stood there, smiling sadly. "It's finished learning you," he said through the door. "If you leave now, it'll follow." I'm writing this from a bus heading south. I didn't take my car. I didn't look back. But sometimes, when I clear my throat or hum to myself, the sound comes back a second later. Perfectly timed, perfectly matched. And I know it's still practicing. I thought distance would save me. That once Pine Ridge disappeared behind snow-covered roads and dead cell zones, whatever lived there would lose interest. For the first few days on the road, everything was quiet. No whistling, no echoes. I started to believe Robert had lied, maybe to keep me from warning anyone. Then, on the third night, I stopped at a roadside motel just outside a small town I don't remember the name of. The room smelled like bleach and old carpet. As I brushed my teeth, I caught myself humming. Something absent-minded, something I'd done 1,000 times before. The sound stopped mid-note. A second later, it continued. Not from my mouth, but from the hallway outside my door. Same tune, same timing, same hesitation on the last note. I froze, toothpaste dripping down my chin, listening as footsteps moved slowly past my room. Whoever or whatever was out there paused right outside my door. I heard a soft whistle, then a quiet knock. Using my voice, it said, "Ethan, you forgot something. I didn't open the door." I backed into the bathroom and locked it, heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed, then hours. When morning came, The hallway was empty, and the motel clerk swore no one had been walking around that night. That's when I realized the truth Pine Ridge never said out loud. The creature didn't belong to the town. The town belonged to it. Pine Ridge was just where it learned best, where people stayed long enough to be copied perfectly. I keep moving now. I never stay in one place more than a night. I don't hum. I don't whistle. I avoid mirrors when I'm tired, because sometimes my reflection lags behind by half a second. If you ever pass through a small town where everyone goes inside too early, where the streets fall silent at the same time every night, and you hear someone whistling a tune you've never taught anyone, don't answer it. Because once it learns you, it doesn't need the forest anymore. Weeks later, I tried to research Pine Ridge. There was almost nothing online. A few old forum posts mentioning strange disappearances, some local news clippings buried in digital archives. One article from the 1980s mentioned a series of vanished teenagers, each last seen whistling as they walked home alone. No bodies, no clues, just gone. That's when I understood the full scope. Pine Ridge didn't just trap people. It taught the forest creature how to mimic, how to draw others in, how to survive unnoticed. Every story I read mirrored what I'd experienced. A whistling in the distance, a shadow that never blinked, a voice that knew too much. I tried warning people online, posting warnings under anonymous accounts. Every message disappeared within hours. The accounts themselves vanished. It was as if whatever learned me also policed my words. I felt eyes watching me through screens, every keystroke a new note for its growing repertoire. The forest had taught it patience, and it never forgot. Now, I live far from any forest, any small town, any street that disappears at sunset. But sometimes, when the wind is right, I hear a soft whistle through the cracks of my apartment window. I know it's practicing, learning my routines, my voice, my thoughts. Last week, my voicemail picked up a message. It wasn't anyone I knew. A slow, deliberate whistle started, followed by my own voice saying, "I see you." My blood ran cold. I know there's no escaping it completely. And maybe that's Pine Ridge's true horror. It doesn't need to trap you physically. If it learns you, it can reach anywhere. So, if you ever find yourself in a town where the streets are empty too early, where the forest feels closer than the houses, and you hear whistling that sounds like you, run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because once it knows you, it never forgets. My name is Lydia Carr, and this happened during the winter I moved to Maple Hollow, a tiny town in Quebec most outsiders don't even know exists. I had taken a teaching position at the local school, excited for solitude and quiet. But what I found was something darker than I could have imagined. The town seemed ordinary during the day. Snow-dusted streets, kids playing under gray skies, smoke curling from chimneys. But nights were different. Each evening, a strange, echoing sound filled the town, bouncing between the narrow alleys and frozen rooftops. It wasn't a wind howl. It wasn't a dog. It was a hollow, reverberating call that seemed to mimic voices from long ago. I first heard it on my third night. It called my name. Not softly, not politely. It repeated my full name, elongated and warped, like it had learned it from somewhere deep inside me. My apartment window rattled with the sound. I pressed my face against the glass, heart pounding. Maple Hollow wasn't quiet. It was listening. The next day, I asked around discreetly. At the local cafe, an elderly man named Henri lowered his voice when I mentioned the sound. "Ah, the echoes," he said, eyes darting toward the frozen streets outside. They only call for those who hear too clearly. He explained in broken words that Maple Hollow had a secret. Every generation, someone would disappear. The echoing voices were not just sounds. They were warnings, or maybe invitations. Henri's hands trembled as he stirred his coffee, muttering, "Some people answer, some don't come back." That evening, the echoes began again, growing louder, circling the apartment like an invisible predator. It wasn't just my name this time. It repeated conversations I'd had that day. My thoughts, my fears. I realized with a shiver that it didn't just echo sound, it echoed life, learning everything about me, molding it, twisting it into something terrifying. I couldn't leave. My car had frozen into the driveway, and the snowstorm had swallowed the road. Maple Hollow had me. That night, the echoes grew bolder. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening as my own voice drifted back at me. Mocking, warped, impossibly distant, yet right inside my head. It called out the things I hadn't spoken aloud. My fears, my regrets, the arguments I'd had with friends and family. Each syllable sent shivers down my spine, as if the town itself had collected pieces of me and was piecing them together into a reflection I didn't want to see. I tried to block it out with music, noise, anything. Nothing worked. The echoes adapted. If I hummed, it hummed back. If I whispered, it whispered back, just slightly slower, like it was learning rhythm and tone, experimenting. When I looked out the window, I saw figures moving through the snow. Not people exactly. Shapes that bent unnaturally, gliding silently from street to street. Their mouths didn't move, yet the echoes came from them. I realized with terror that the echoes weren't just sound. They were alive. The next day, I tried to leave Maple Hollow, but the snowstorm had thickened into a wall of white, swallowing roads and landmarks. My car was buried under 3 feet of ice and snow. Panic crept in. I was trapped. That afternoon, I went back to the cafe to ask Henri for help. But the cafe was empty. Chairs overturned. Coffee still steaming in mugs, but no sign of life. My heart hammered. I called out, but my voice returned to me, echoed and distorted, faster than I could react. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of footprints leading away from the cafe. Perfectly human, until they bent unnaturally, crossing over frozen benches, vanishing into midair. And at the edge of my vision, shadows mimicked my movements exactly, moving before I did. I realized then that Maple Hollow didn't just trap people physically. It trapped their presence, their echoes. And the longer you stayed, the more complete the copy became. By the 5th night, the echoes had learned my routines completely. Every movement I made, every word I whispered to myself, returned warped and sinister. When I ate, it mimicked chewing sounds I hadn't made aloud. When I closed my eyes, it hummed lullabies I hadn't heard since childhood, distorted and wrong. Sleep became impossible. I tried writing everything down, keeping a journal to separate my real thoughts from the echoes. But the words on the page shifted overnight. When I woke, sentences were crossed out, rewritten in my own handwriting, but spelling and punctuation subtly wrong. Whoever, or whatever, was learning me could rewrite reality as well as mimic sound. That night, I heard footsteps in the snow outside. I forced myself to look through the window. The shapes were there again, dark, faceless figures gliding effortlessly, circling the apartment like predators. One paused at my window, tilted its head, and the echo of my own voice whispered back, perfectly synchronized. "Lydia, why are you hiding?" I realized Maple Hollow wasn't just a town. It was a prison for identity itself. I decided I had to leave. I dug through the snow, breaking the ice that encased my car, and drove blindly down the whitewashed roads. The echoes followed. Every mile, every turn, I heard fragments of my own voice calling back, distorted, angry, pleading. When I thought I had escaped, I stopped at a small gas station for fuel. The attendant was silent, staring at me with eyes too wide, too knowing. Behind him, the walls seemed to ripple like ice, and I could hear dozens of whispers. My own voice, my thoughts, my name. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but the words twisted as they left my lips. "You cannot leave," the whispers said, though no one had spoken. I ran, abandoning the car and everything I owned. I ran through the frozen woods alongside the highway, hoping to disappear into the night. Maple Hollow didn't just echo, you realized it followed, imprinting your existence onto the town and beyond. By the seventh night, exhaustion had taken over. But the echoes never relented. I hid in an abandoned cabin near the edge of the forest, hoping the walls would shield me. They didn't. The whispers were inside the cabin, echoing from corners I couldn't reach. They repeated fragments of conversations I had decades ago, things I hadn't told anyone. It was as if the town had reached into my mind and recorded everything. Suddenly, the door creaked open, though the wind had stopped. A shadow glided in without a sound, moving unnaturally, its faceless head tilting as it watched me. Then, it whispered in my voice, "You can't run from yourself." I backed away, fumbling for a weapon, anything, but my hands passed through it like mist. The echoes laughed, my own laughter, twisted and cruel. That's when I understood. Maple Hollow didn't just trap people physically or mimic voices. It trapped their souls, reflecting them back in distorted form until you lost yourself completely. The eighth night, I attempted to leave on foot, braving the snow and darkness. Every step I took was echoed immediately behind me. My own footfalls, my breath, even the snap of branches I didn't touch. The echoes weren't just sounds anymore. They were predators, tracking me, anticipating me, learning every movement. I tried running, zigzagging through the forest, but the whispers formed words, predicting where I'd go next. Left, stop, crouch. Every instruction was my voice, commanding me, urging me into traps I couldn't see. I stumbled into a hollowed-out tree, and the echoes surrounded me in a circle, almost physical now, pressing in from all sides. I realized with crushing certainty that escaping Maple Hollow wasn't about distance. It was about identity. The town could reach you anywhere. If it learned you, it could exist in your voice, your actions, even your dreams. And once that happened, there was no running. By the ninth night, I was exhausted, cold, and barely coherent. I had been moving for days, hiding in snowdrifts and abandoned cabins. But the echoes were relentless. Every sound I made, every whisper, every sigh, was mirrored back at me, distorted, taunting. I stopped trusting my own voice, afraid that speaking would give it more power. Then I heard a new sound. Laughter. My own laughter, but stretched, slowed, and warped. It came from all directions, as if the forest itself had grown mouths. I stumbled into a frozen stream, sliding on the ice, trying to escape the auditory prison. The echoes followed every twist, every slip, repeating my panic perfectly. I realized Maple Hollow had perfected its method over decades, maybe centuries. The town didn't just capture bodies, it captured minds, twisting memories, voices, and identities into an unrecognizable reflection. And if you ever tried to leave, the echoes would follow, haunting you, teaching you, shaping you into something else entirely. I finally found my way to a highway leading to civilization. I thought I had escaped. But as I approached the lights of a distant town, I heard it again. Soft, patient, familiar. My own voice, calling my name from the shadows of the snow-laden trees. I looked over my shoulder, and for a brief second, I thought I saw my reflection in the snow. But it was wrong. Its movements were delayed by half a second, its head tilting in a mocking curiosity. I ran into the lights, but I knew it didn't matter. Maple Hollow had learned me. My voice, my fears, my rhythm. It carried beyond the town, beyond the forest. Even now, miles away, when I speak, I sometimes hear myself echoing back in places I've never been. And I know it is still listening, still learning, still waiting. Maple Hollow doesn't just trap people. It traps them in time, in sound, in memory. And sometimes, that trap reaches beyond the snow, beyond the forest, to find you wherever you go. My name is Derek Monroe, and this happened the summer I moved to Cranberry Creek, a tiny riverside town in British Columbia, tucked between dense forests and mist-covered hills. I had inherited an old cabin from my late uncle and thought it would be the perfect escape from city life. The town seemed peaceful enough during the day. Fishermen casting lines, kids playing along the riverbanks, and a single general store where everyone knew your name. But at night, something changed. The air would grow unnaturally still, the forest's edge pressing close to the cabin, and I started seeing shadows that weren't mine. At first, I told myself it was just imagination or fatigue from moving. But soon, I began noticing movement in the corner of my eyes. Tall, thin figures lurking between trees, disappearing when I looked directly at them. The first time I heard the whispers, I froze. They weren't words, just low guttural murmurs coming from the darkness, seeming to move with intention. The second night, the shadows grew bolder. I was fixing dinner when I saw one step from behind the tree line, tall and featureless, its limbs bending unnaturally. I froze, knife in hand, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But then I heard the whispers again, closer this time, in my own voice, echoing the thoughts I had barely admitted to myself. I ran to the window and it disappeared. My heart raced, pounding against my chest, but the whispering didn't stop. It circled the cabin like wind-carrying words, but words that weren't wind. Something alive was learning me, learning my fear. The locals were no help when I asked about the shadows. "Don't wander near the forest at night," said a fisherman named Tommy, his eyes hollow, voice hushed. "It knows what you fear, and it waits for it." That night, I slept with all the lights on, but I could still feel them watching, silent and patient, just beyond the tree line. By the third night, I was terrified to move. Every time I stepped outside, the shadows followed, sliding silently between the trees, always staying just at the edge of vision. I tried shining a flashlight, but it didn't faze them. They didn't run, didn't flinch, just watched. The whispers grew louder, repeating my thoughts in slow, mocking tones. One moment, I thought I saw a figure leaning against the cabin wall outside. But when I blinked, nothing was there. The air felt heavier, almost physical, like the forest was pressing down on me. My nerves frayed. Every sound, the wind rattling the cabin, the creek flowing, sounded like it was coming from the shadows themselves. I realized the shadows weren't random. They were studying me. Every movement I made, every sound I uttered, they recorded. They were patient predators, learning my habits, my fears, until they could predict my every move. And deep down, I knew one mistake would be my last. The fourth night, I made the mistake of stepping outside. I wanted to prove to myself it was just fear. But as soon as I crossed the porch, I froze. One shadow had moved closer, its limbs twisted unnaturally, its head tilting in a way no human neck could. The whispers began again, this time forming words I recognized. "You can't leave," it said in my own voice. "You're mine." I stumbled backward into the cabin and slammed the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The shadows pressed against the walls, murmuring my secrets back to me, twisting them into threats I hadn't even spoken aloud. Every corner I looked, every reflection, held a form of them. Sometimes humanoid, sometimes monstrous, but always patient. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner, clutching a flashlight like a weapon, knowing that the shadows weren't just watching. They were waiting. And I was running out of time. By the fifth night, I could no longer leave the cabin. Every path into the forest seemed to bend, twist, and close behind me. The shadows weren't confined to the trees anymore. They slid along the ground, through cracks in the cabin walls, and sometimes I caught glimpses of them reflected in mirrors and windows, moving independently of reality. The whispers became clearer, more intentional. They repeated my fears, my regrets, the secrets I had buried. I could hear them in every corner of the room, circling me, forming words I had never spoken aloud. It was no longer just mimicry. They were learning me, memorizing me, molding themselves to me. That night, I saw the first shadow inside the cabin. It stood in the kitchen doorway, perfectly still, featureless, yet somehow maliciously aware. I tried to shine my flashlight, but the beam passed right through it. It was patient, waiting for me to move, waiting for the moment I slipped. I realized Cranberry Creek wasn't haunted. It was a predator. The sixth night, I tried to fight back. I placed candles in a circle, lit sage, anything I could think of to push the darkness away. But the shadows moved effortlessly through the flames, the smoke curling around them without resistance. The whispers followed me, twisting my own words into threats. I grabbed a hammer and patrolled the cabin, shouting, swinging at anything I thought I saw. Each strike passed through emptiness, yet the murmuring grew louder, sharper, more precise, echoing my heartbeat. It was as if the shadows were learning my strength, my limits, my patterns, adapting faster than I could react. Hours passed like minutes. When dawn finally came, the shadows retreated to the edges of the forest, but I knew they hadn't gone. They were patient. They would wait. I finally understood the truth. Cranberry Creek didn't need to touch you physically. It only needed time to learn you, to map your fears, and eventually, it would follow, no matter where I went. By the seventh night, exhaustion had set in, and I could barely think straight. Every shadow felt alive now, moving with intent, sliding closer when I blinked, vanishing when I looked directly. I stopped leaving the cabin altogether, barricading doors and windows, hoping to contain whatever was learning me. But the shadows were patient. They didn't rush. They circled the cabin in silence. Their presence felt more than seen. The whispers became my own thoughts, suggesting actions I hadn't considered, planting fear in places I thought were safe. Even my dreams weren't safe. I would wake up hearing my own voice urging me to go outside, to step into the forest. It became clear that the shadows didn't just mimic, they manipulated. They were learning me so well that my own instincts became traps. Every choice I made, every attempt to hide, fed them knowledge, shaping their next move. The realization left me paralyzed. Cranberry Creek didn't want to kill me. It wanted to own me. The eighth night, I decided to document everything. I set up my camera, recording the shadows and the whispering as evidence. But when I reviewed the footage, my blood ran cold. The shadows were missing. The audio captured my voice perfectly, but none of the shapes appeared. They had learned how to exist without being seen, feeding on the fear they induced rather than physical presence. I heard the whispers directly behind me as I watched the playback. "You belong here," they said in my voice, slower, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I spun around. Nothing. Silence. Yet I could feel them in every corner of the cabin, pressing against the walls, circling the room like hunters stalking prey. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, gripping a flashlight and hammer, knowing the shadows would not rest either. Cranberry Creek had taught them patience, and patience was all they needed. By the ninth night, I had reached my breaking point. The shadows no longer just lingered, they anticipated me. Every step, every glance, every whispered thought was mirrored, manipulated, distorted. I could hear them moving inside the cabin, circling me in silence. Their presence almost tactile, pressing against my skin, chilling my blood. I tried to escape, running through the forest paths toward the highway. But the shadows flitted between trees, blocking my progress without ever touching me. The whispers now knew my name, my fears, even my secrets I hadn't spoken aloud. Every attempt to hide or outsmart them only fed their knowledge. It was like the forest itself had become a living map of me. Every tree and shadow a marker, every sound a note in their song of control. For the first time, I understood fully. Cranberry Creek didn't want me dead. It wanted me entirely rewritten. A puppet whose strings were fear and reflection, trapped forever by the knowledge of myself that the shadows had stolen. The 10th night, I stumbled into the remains of an old ranger station deep in the forest, hoping for refuge. The shadows followed. I could feel their presence wrapping around the building, pressing at doors and windows, whispering my thoughts back at me. I realized that no barrier could stop them. No barricade, no weapon, no fire. They existed in the space between fear and reality. I left the station at dawn, staggering toward civilization, but the shadows didn't vanish. When I finally reached a main road, I looked back, and for a moment, the forest appeared empty. But the whispers followed me all the way to town. My reflection in the rearview mirror flickered, delayed, as if it were alive, a version of me shaped by the shadows' patience. Even now, months later, I hear them when I'm alone. Soft murmurs, subtle movements. Reminders that Cranberry Creek doesn't need to capture you physically. It only needs to learn you completely. And once it does, it never lets go. My name is Ethan Marshall, and this happened the summer I joined a group of friends for a hiking trip near Blackwood Falls, a remote gorge in Ontario surrounded by dense forest and jagged cliffs. We were excited for adventure, unaware of the dark history buried in the rocks and mist. The falls themselves were breathtaking, towering walls of water cascading into a deep, shadowed pool. But an eerie silence lingered just beyond the sound of rushing water. The first night, I noticed something strange. A girl from our group, Claire, went missing while gathering firewood. At first, we assumed she had wandered off to explore, but hours passed, and the forest swallowed her footprints. I called her name into the trees, my voice swallowed by the echo of the falls. Then I heard it, a faint laughter, soft and playful, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't Claire's voice, but it sounded like it. The forest was hiding something patient, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We split into groups to search for Claire. But the forest felt wrong. Paths twisted, landmarks repeated, and every call I made returned distorted, almost mocking. Then I saw it. A shadow moving between the trees, darting closer when we tried to approach, disappearing before we could get a clear look. My stomach churned with fear. By nightfall, panic set in. We circled the campsite, shouting, using flashlights. But the shadows seemed to know our movements, always staying just out of reach. I heard whispers this time. Soft, almost indistinguishable. But unmistakably Claire's voice, calling my name from somewhere far too close. One friend, Mark, swore he saw her standing at the edge of the pool, her feet not touching the water. When he blinked, she was gone. And yet, laughter echoed again, slower, warped, as if the forest was replaying her presence for us, teasing our fear. By the end of that night, I realized Blackwood Falls didn't just hide people. It erased them from reality, leaving only the echo of their existence behind. By the third day, our group was fraying. Tension built with every failed attempt to find Claire. The forest seemed to shift, paths looping back on themselves, cliffs appearing where we swore they weren't. The mist clung to the gorge like a living thing, and the whispers had grown louder, now calling all of us by name, twisting our own words against us. I decided to follow a faint trail along the cliffside. The mist parted just enough to show footprints leading toward the edge, but they were too precise, too intentional, like someone had walked there knowing we would follow. And then I saw her reflection in the pool below, shimmering in the dark water. But it wasn't right. Her eyes were hollow, and her smile was impossibly wide. When I tried to call out, the mist absorbed my voice, and a distorted version came back. "Don't look, stay here." My blood ran cold. Whatever haunted Blackwood Falls didn't want to be confronted. It wanted us to see but never reach her. That night, we tried to camp on higher ground, thinking the cliffs would give us a vantage point. But the forest refused to let us rest. The whispers came in waves, layering over one another, repeating secrets we hadn't shared, twisting our words into commands. I couldn't tell my own thoughts from the forest's. Suddenly, I saw movement at the tree line. Claire was there, or something that looked like her, stepping closer with an unnatural fluidity. Her face flickered between familiar and grotesque, her eyes empty yet full of malice and sorrow at once. She extended her hand, and I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted. Mark screamed behind me. Another shadow emerged from the mist, taller, darker, and moving impossibly fast. It wasn't human. It lunged toward him, and I could only hear his shout swallowed by the forest, leaving only silence and her warped laughter echoing back. I realized then that Blackwood Falls didn't just take people. It reshaped them, blending them into the mist until nothing remained of who they once were. By the fifth day, despair had taken over. The forest seemed alive, almost sentient, rearranging paths and echoes to confuse us. Every step we took was tracked, every movement anticipated. I could hear Claire's laughter again, now layered with dozens of whispers, repeating everything I feared, my own voice now betraying me. I ventured closer to the pool at the bottom of the gorge, hoping for a sign. But the reflection staring back was not Claire. Her face twisted in unnatural angles, mouth opening and closing silently. And when I looked away, I glimpsed her in the shadows, always at the edge of my vision, just out of reach. I realized then that Blackwood Falls didn't just take you physically. It erased your presence, leaving behind only echoes of who you were. The shadows and mist weren't just hiding her. They were reshaping her into something the forest controlled, something patient, waiting for anyone else who dared to enter its grip. That night, I barely slept. I could hear movement outside the tent, whispers curling into the canvas like tendrils. Every sound, branches snapping, water flowing, was amplified, twisted, and repeated, mimicking my own voice. The forest itself had become a predator, learning my rhythm, my fear, my weakness. I decided to leave at dawn, but the mist thickened, hiding every path, every landmark. When I stumbled upon the edge of the gorge, I saw her, Claire, standing perfectly still near the waterfall. Her reflection shimmered in the water, yet it was wrong. Angles bent unnaturally, her eyes hollow and unblinking. I called out, but the mist swallowed my voice. When I blinked, she was gone. The whispers intensified, circling me, repeating my own thoughts, forcing panic. I finally understood. Blackwood Falls didn't just take people. It claimed them, rewriting them into the forest itself, until all that remained were echoes, whispers, and distorted reflections that preyed on anyone who dared follow. By the seventh day, exhaustion and fear had warped our minds. Every time I glanced at the forest, I felt eyes on me, even though nothing could be seen. The whispers were constant now, echoing through the mist, repeating my own words back in twisted forms, adding threats and commands I had never spoken. Every attempt to move forward or retrace our steps failed. The forest seemed to rearrange itself, closing paths, opening new ones that led us deeper into its grasp. I caught a glimpse of Claire again near the edge of the gorge, but she wasn't alone. Shadows extended from her body, black tendrils coiling into the mist, connecting her to the forest itself. When I called out, she turned toward me, but her face flickered between human and something monstrous, her eyes hollow and endless. I understood fully. The forest was no longer just a place. It had claimed her, and now it wanted to claim us too. The eighth day, desperation drove me to climb higher along the cliffside, hoping to find a vantage point and see a way out. Mist swirled thick around me, and the forest seemed alive, breathing, shifting, closing in. I could hear multiple whispers at once, all in Claire's voice, layered with distorted laughter, calling my name from every direction. Suddenly, I saw movement below. A shadow, stretching impossibly tall, stepped from the mist and mirrored my every motion. The reflection in the water below was not mine. It was a warped, hollow version, smiling maliciously. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs refused. I realized Blackwood Falls didn't need to touch you physically. It only needed to observe, learn, and manipulate, turning fear into control, twisting reality around its victims. By the end of that day, I understood the forest had won. Claire was gone, and we were already becoming part of the echoes, trapped between fear and reflection, prey to a place that consumed identity. By the ninth day, hope had all but vanished. Every path we tried led to mist and shadows, as if the forest itself were alive and guiding us toward despair. I could feel the whispers circling, repeating my fears, twisting memories of Claire, replaying them with subtle variations that made my blood run cold. I ventured to the base of the gorge alone, desperate for any clue. The pool was still, too still, reflecting the forest above like a black mirror. And then I saw her, or what had become of her, rising slowly from the water, faceless at first, then flickering into something recognizable, but grotesquely stretched. The shadows of the trees seemed to merge with her, binding her to the forest. My voice caught in my throat, and the mist itself seemed to close around me, pressing, testing, knowing my fear. It became clear, Blackwood Falls didn't just take you physically. It erased you from the world. leaving only whispers, reflections, and distorted echoes to haunt anyone who dared follow. The 10th day, I finally stumbled toward a faint trail that led back to civilization. The mist was thinning, but the whispers remained, subtle now, layered beneath the sounds of the forest. I looked back once and thought I saw Claire at the edge of the gorge, standing silently, her figure flickering between human and something otherworldly. I blinked, and she was gone. Even now, weeks later, I hear the faint echo of her voice in quiet places, the forest's whispers carrying my own fears back to me. Blackwood Falls doesn't just claim people. It remembers them, reshapes them, and leaves their echoes behind to haunt anyone who wanders too close. And the forest waits, patient, knowing there will always be someone else who thinks they can escape. I left Ontario, but Blackwood Falls left a mark on me I will never shake. The echoes, the whispers, and the shadows, they are still there, waiting. My name is Lydia Carter, and this happened during my internship as a historian documenting abandoned psychiatric institutions across Ontario. Red Pine Asylum was notorious. Closed abruptly in the 1970s after a string of mysterious patient disappearances. The building stood on a hill, surrounded by dense pine forests, its windows shattered, graffiti covering walls, and a faint metallic stench lingering in the air. I arrived with my camera and notebooks, eager to document history. But from the moment I stepped onto the grounds, I felt eyes watching me. The forest around the asylum was unnaturally quiet, every sound absorbed as if the building itself had swallowed it. As I walked the crumbling halls, I noticed something strange. Faint shadows moving just out of the corner of my eye, vanishing when I turned. Then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps in an empty corridor. The sound wasn't just behind me, it was following me, echoing my own movements, learning my pace. I realized quickly that Red Pine wasn't abandoned in the way I had thought. Something remained, patient, aware, and hungry for attention. That night, I stayed in what had once been the main lobby. Moonlight spilled through broken windows, casting fractured patterns across the dusty floor. I set up cameras and recorded my surroundings, but every playback revealed strange distortions, shadows in corners that didn't exist when I filmed. I heard whispers, low, guttural, almost indistinguishable, but unmistakably human. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, growing louder as I approached a hallway leading to the former patient wards. I noticed writing on the peeling paint. Cryptic messages scratched into the walls, some just names, others simple phrases like, "He watches," or "Don't sleep." Then I felt it, a presence behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The tapping returned, faster this time, echoing off the walls, following me as I moved. Red Pine Asylum wasn't just abandoned, it had become something alive, feeding on curiosity, on fear, and on anyone foolish enough to enter. By the third night, I had ventured deeper into the asylum, into the old patient wards. The air grew colder with every step, carrying a metallic tang that made my throat burn. Shadows clung to the corners of the halls, moving independently of light, stretching along the walls, always just out of focus. I heard soft murmurs. Patience, perhaps, but distorted, warped into something inhuman. I entered what had been the therapy room. Chairs were overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and the walls were covered in scrawled words. "He knows. She will follow." And my name, Lydia, etched repeatedly. My heart pounded as I realized the asylum knew I had come. A tapping sound echoed from the far end of the hallway, I turned slowly, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing, except the shadows now moving faster, slithering along the floor, forming shapes that resembled people long gone. Red Pine was not a building. It was a trap, alive and aware, feeding on fear, counting my every move, and preparing for the moment I would falter. The fourth night, I attempted to record more evidence, setting cameras in the hallways. When I reviewed the footage, I froze. The shadows were absent from the cameras, yet I could hear the tapping and whispers clearly. The asylum had learned how to exist beyond physical sight, manipulating sound, space, and perception itself. I walked cautiously down a long corridor, feeling a presence behind me, circling, whispering in voices I recognized. Patients, doctors, even my own voice, mocking my fear. One shadow flickered against the wall like a person stretching, then shrank, merging with darkness. I tried to leave, but every exit led me back inside. The asylum had trapped me in a maze that wasn't architectural. It was psychological, reshaping reality, feeding off my terror, and forcing me to confront the echoes of people who had vanished decades ago. I realized that Red Pine Asylum didn't just house spirits. It had become a predator. By the fifth night, I had stopped trying to understand. Every step I took, every turn I made, the asylum anticipated me. The shadows were no longer just in corners. They followed me along the walls, stretching unnaturally, sometimes forming vague human shapes, sometimes just amorphous darkness. The whispers had grown louder, layered, echoing not only voices from the past, but my own fears back at me, warped and sharpened. I ventured into the basement, where the faint smell of rust and decay was stronger than ever. Old medical equipment lay scattered, covered in dust, and the shadows clung to the walls like living paint. Then I saw her, a figure in a tattered nurse's uniform, standing motionless at the far end of the room. Her eyes were hollow, black voids, and the whispers grew into a chorus of commands. Stay. Stay forever. Red Pine wasn't just haunted. It learned, manipulated, and trapped, feeding off my terror, counting the seconds until I would collapse under its suffocating presence. The sixth night, I decided to confront it. I lit candles in a circle, hoping some ritual or light might hold the darkness back. But the shadows ignored the flames, slipping through smoke and light effortlessly. Every whisper now felt like it was inside my head, repeating my own thoughts, distorting my sanity, pressing on me from all directions. I backed into a corner, clutching my camera like a shield, and noticed one shadow had separated from the rest. It moved with deliberate intent, gliding across the floor toward me, its form flickering between human and monstrous. The whispers grew urgent, almost threatening. It's time. It's time. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed upright, terrified to close my eyes. Red Pine Asylum didn't just hold history, it consumed it, reshaping the past and present into a living, breathing nightmare, feeding on anyone who thought they could uncover its secrets. By the seventh night, I had begun to lose track of time. The asylum's layout seemed alive, corridors twisting impossibly, doors leading back to places I had already passed. Shadows no longer hid. They stalked, sliding across walls and floors, mimicking my movements with an uncanny precision. Every whisper, every faint creak echoed directly in my mind, repeating fears I'd never spoken aloud. I ventured into the old operating theater. Rusted instruments lay scattered like relics of cruelty, and the shadows pooled in the corners, slowly coalescing into human forms. One figure stepped forward. It looked like a doctor, but his features flickered, eyes hollow and mouth opening in a silent scream. The whispers converged into a single voice, my own. distorted, saying, "You belong here." I realized that Red Pine Asylum didn't just haunt. It learned, predicted, and claimed. Any fear it observed became a tool, a leash pulling me deeper into its web, twisting the building into a trap that I couldn't escape. The 8th night, I tried to record everything, hoping evidence could help me understand or escape. But the cameras betrayed me. The shadows never appeared on footage. They existed outside reality, feeding off fear, observing silently, invisible yet omnipresent. Every whisper, every creak was magnified in my mind, circling me relentlessly. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, though the hall remained empty. My own shadow on the wall flickered unnaturally, elongating, stretching, twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. I could feel its attention, the deliberate malice of something that understood me completely, knowing my weaknesses, predicting my panic. I stumbled to the main hall, hoping for daylight, for escape, but the doors led nowhere. Red Pine Asylum wasn't a building, it was a living trap, feeding on sanity, on fear, on every misstep. I understood that it didn't just haunt. It claimed identities, twisted minds, and left its victims as shadows of themselves. By the 9th night, exhaustion and terror had fused into something I could barely recognize. The asylum seemed to breathe, walls expanding and contracting, corridors twisting unnaturally. Shadows moved independently, sliding over walls, pooling at corners, and coalescing into grotesque human shapes. Every whisper was inside my head now, repeating fears I didn't even know I had, each one sharper than the last. I found myself in the old records room, dusty ledgers scattered across broken desks. On one page, I saw my name written repeatedly, alongside dates I hadn't lived. The shadows coalesced near the shelves, one figure stepping forward. It looked like me, but twisted, hollow-eyed, whispering in my voice, "You stay." Red Pine Asylum didn't just trap people. It learned them, anticipated them, and reshaped them. I realized fully that the building wasn't haunted. It was alive, patient, a predator that fed on identity and fear, turning every visitor into a shadow of themselves before releasing them to the echoes. The 10th night, I knew I had to escape, or be claimed entirely. I ran through hallways that seemed to stretch infinitely, shadows slithering at the edges of my vision, following my every step. Whispers echoed, layering my own voice over distorted sounds of long-dead patients and staff. I burst into the main lobby at dawn, exhausted and disoriented. The forest outside glimmered in morning light, a false promise of safety. When I looked back at the asylum, the shadows inside froze, staring back at me, their hollow eyes knowing, waiting for my return. The building didn't care if I escaped physically. It had learned me, tracked my thoughts, and left pieces of me behind in every echo, every whisper, and every shadow. Even now, I can feel it watching, reminding me that Red Pine Asylum doesn't simply haunt. It collects, reshapes, and never truly lets go. And I fear the day I return, even unwillingly, into its grasp. My name is David Hughes, and this happened during the winter. I took a temporary job as a caretaker for an old estate in Pine Hollow, a small, secluded town in northern Ontario. The mansion had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded up, frost clinging to the edges of its stone walls, and the surrounding forest dense and silent. The townsfolk warned me never to go inside after dark, but I thought it was just superstition. The first night, I noticed something odd. While checking the old hallways, I heard faint footsteps in rooms I hadn't entered. The air was unnaturally cold, and a low whisper seemed to drift from the walls just beyond comprehension. I called out, but my voice only echoed back to me, distorted. By midnight, I realized the house wasn't empty. Shadows moved in corners, and the furniture seemed slightly displaced, as though unseen residents were observing, waiting, learning my routine. Pine Hollow wasn't just quiet. It was alive, and it had been waiting for someone like me. That night, I set up in what had been the main lounge, a grand room covered in dust and cobwebs. Every sound, my footsteps, the creak of the old floorboards, was magnified, bouncing off the walls and echoing like distant voices. I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a silhouette standing silently, frozen but impossibly watching. I tried to dismiss it, blaming shadows and exhaustion. But the whispers returned, soft and indecipherable, layered with what sounded like muffled conversations from another time. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of figures, pale and indistinct, vanishing when I tried to approach. By dawn, I realized the estate had its own inhabitants, silent, unseen, and patient. They didn't speak, but they were aware, observing me. Pine Hollow's mansion was a trap for the unwary, and I was slowly becoming part of its silent congregation, learning that isolation here was more than physical. It was psychological and terrifying. By the third night, the mansion's presence became suffocating. Every corridor seemed alive, stretching and shifting as if the building itself were watching my movements. I heard soft footsteps trailing me, coming from rooms I hadn't entered. Sometimes, a chair would move slightly. A door would creak open just a fraction, as if unseen eyes were testing my awareness. I ventured into the upstairs gallery, where portraits of long-dead residents stared at me with eerily lifelike eyes. Their gazes seemed to follow me, judging, waiting, warning. A low whisper came from behind a door at the end of the hall, repeating my own name in a tone both curious and malicious. I felt a presence brush past me, cold and heavy, leaving the faint scent of old wood and decay. It wasn't a ghost. It was something older, more patient, aware of every heartbeat and every hesitation. Pine Hollow's mansion wasn't haunted. It owned its silence, and I had become part of it. The fourth night, I explored the east wing, where the smell of mildew and decay was strongest. The floors groaned under my weight, but the footsteps following me were lighter, faster, almost taunting. Whispers intertwined with the sound of the wind outside, forming half-words, phrases that made no sense yet carried intent. I discovered a room locked from the inside, yet the key lay on the floor outside. Pushing the door open, I entered a small study covered in dusty ledgers and journals. The shadows were thickest here, pooling in corners, flickering like they were alive and breathing. On one desk, a journal lay open, detailing events from decades ago, accounts of caretakers who had vanished without a trace, each describing whispers, movement, and shadows that watched constantly. By the time I left the room, I understood the truth. Pine Hollow's mansion had always been inhabited, not by spirits, but by its silent residents, patient watchers who ensured no one ever left untouched by its presence. By the fifth night, exhaustion and unease had taken root. Every step through the mansion felt predicted, every sound amplified in ways that made my skin crawl. Shadows no longer lingered. They moved with purpose, gliding along walls and floors, appearing at the edges of vision and vanishing when confronted. Whispers had become coherent now, repeating my fears aloud, mocking my attempts at understanding. I descended into the cellar, where the cold was sharper, the air heavy with mildew. Crates and barrels were stacked haphazardly, and I saw faint handprints in the dust, too small, too deliberate to be mine. A shadow detached from the darkness, forming a vague humanoid shape. It didn't speak, but I felt its attention, its hunger. Every instinct screamed to run, yet my body froze, trapped by the oppressive presence. Pine Hollow's mansion wasn't just haunted, it was alive, aware, and patient. It fed on fear, learned routines, and observed silently, ensuring that those who entered could never leave untouched. The sixth night, I tried to assert control, lighting candles and marking my path through the mansion. The shadows paid no heed. They slid through smoke and light, appearing where they chose, leaving whispers that echoed my own thoughts back at me in warped forms. Every corner I turned, figures flickered in peripheral vision, disappearing when I looked directly, taunting and patient. I returned to the Grand Lounge, desperate for familiarity. But it had changed. Furniture shifted, walls seemed closer, ceilings lower, as though the house itself were restructuring to trap me. I could hear faint, measured breathing, though I was alone. A chair rocked slightly on its own, and I realized the silent residents weren't merely observing. They were interacting subtly, testing my responses and feeding off the tension. By sunrise, I understood the truth. Pine Hollow's mansion wasn't abandoned. Its residents, silent and unseen, had existed for decades, watching, shaping, and claiming anyone foolish enough to spend more than a night inside. By the seventh night, my mind was fraying. The mansion no longer seemed like a building. It was a living entity, breathing around me, reshaping corridors, and shifting shadows with intent. Whispers now spoke in my own voice, repeating every doubt, every fear I had tried to suppress, layering them until I couldn't tell which were real. I wandered into the upper tower, a place I hadn't dared enter before. The windows were broken, frost biting through the cracks, and the room was empty, except for shadows pooling in the corners. One shadow moved independently, flickering into humanoid form, tall and thin, its face blank but exuding malice. It raised a hand, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The mansion wasn't just observing me anymore. It was testing me, shaping my fear, preparing me to become one of its silent residents. Every instinct screamed to leave, but my body was frozen, trapped by the oppressive intelligence of the house. Pine Hollow was patient, and I was its prey. The eighth night, I attempted to document everything, setting cameras and taking notes. But the mansion seemed to erase evidence of itself. Shadows didn't appear on footage, and recordings of whispers came back distorted, warped into eerie tones I couldn't comprehend. I followed faint footsteps into the dining hall, and every step echoed unnaturally, as though multiple presences moved in tandem with me. Chairs shifted slightly, and for a brief second, I saw the vague forms of children and adults standing silently, watching, waiting. The air was thick with anticipation. The mansion didn't need to speak. It conveyed intent through movement, temperature, and fear itself. I realized with a sinking dread that Pine Hollow's silent residents weren't ghosts. They were observers, manipulators, and predators, patient for decades, waiting for anyone who dared intrude. Each whisper, each shadow, was designed to break me slowly, ensuring that the mansion kept its history alive through terror. By the ninth night, I was no longer certain of reality. The mansion's corridors had become a maze of shadows and whispers, each step echoing in ways that made me question my own memory. Shadows no longer hid. They stalked, elongated, and merged with walls, shaping themselves into forms I recognized but could never fully see. The whispers called my name, repeating fears I hadn't spoken aloud, growing louder with every heartbeat. I found a small parlor, untouched by time, yet the air was heavy. In the corner, A shadowy figure crouched, resembling a former caretaker I had seen in old photographs. It rose slowly, faceless, and moved toward me silently. The mansion wasn't simply haunted. It remembered, waited, and fed on my terror, learning every weakness, every hesitation, every flicker of doubt. By now I realized I had become part of the mansion's legacy. Pine Hollow didn't just isolate its victims, it claimed their presence, leaving them as echoes and shadows to trap the next intruder. The 10th night, I knew I had to escape, or lose myself entirely. I ran through corridors that twisted impossibly, shadows moving in tandem with me, whispers layering over my own thoughts, urging hesitation, feeding fear. Doors led me in circles, hallways stretched beyond reason, and the mansion responded to my panic with precision. Finally, I stumbled into the grand entrance hall as the first light of dawn touched the windows. The shadows froze, their faceless figures watching silently. Pine Hollow had not physically trapped me. It had left parts of me behind in every whisper, every echo, every shadow, ensuring I could never forget and never truly escape. Even now, long after leaving the mansion, I feel eyes watching me in quiet rooms, footsteps following me in empty streets, faint whispers carrying my own voice. Pine Hollow's silent residents are patient. They wait, and one day, they will claim again. My name is Ethan Miller, and this happened during a summer trip to Misty Lake, a remote part of British Columbia known for its dense forests and eerie fog that never seemed to lift. I had rented a small, abandoned cabin on the lake's edge, thinking it would be a quiet retreat to write and fish. The locals avoided this part of the lake, but I dismissed their warnings as small-town superstition. The first night, the fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen, swallowing the cabin in a gray, suffocating haze. I heard sounds from the forest, soft footsteps, rustling leaves. But there was no wind, no animal I could recognize. When I looked outside, I glimpsed figures moving between the trees, just out of clear view, vanishing when I blinked. By midnight, I realized the cabin wasn't as empty as it seemed. Shadows lingered in the corners of the rooms, faint whispers echoed through the walls, and Misty Lake itself seemed to watch, patient and alive, waiting for night to fall. Or that night, I tried to focus on writing, but every sound was amplified. The creak of the wooden floor, the drip of water from a leaky roof, the soft rustle outside that seemed too deliberate to be random. I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, figures appearing at the edges of the fog outside the cabin, vanishing when I turned to confront them. I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, hoping to shake off the creeping unease. The lake lay still, mirror-like, but reflected shapes that weren't in reality. Twisted silhouettes of people and trees bending unnaturally, flickering in and out of existence. A whisper carried across the water, faint and distorted, repeating my name. I realized then that Misty Lake wasn't just isolated. It was alive with unseen watchers, guardians or predators that had been here far longer than anyone alive. The cabin was not a refuge. It was a trap, and I had become its latest observer. By the third night, the unease had turned into terror. Every creak of the cabin felt like footsteps approaching, and every shadow outside the window seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching toward me. I tried to sleep, but the fog pressed against the glass, thick and almost suffocating, and the whispers grew louder, distorted, sometimes almost forming words I couldn't understand. I decided to explore the surrounding woods despite the fear. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches clawing at the fog. Shapes moved between them, pausing to watch. then vanishing before I could get a clear look. At one point, I glimpsed a pale face peering from behind a tree, eyes black voids, disappearing when I blinked. Misty Lake itself seemed complicit. The water reflected not reality but warped, shifting images, as though recording and distorting everything I did. I realized the cabin was never abandoned. It was a lure, a bait, and the lake had been waiting patiently for anyone foolish enough to step inside its fog-shrouded trap. The fourth night, the whispers grew more insistent, almost taunting me, calling my name in a voice I couldn't distinguish from my own thoughts. I heard movement inside the cabin, though no one was there. Objects shifted slightly. A chair rocked, a book slid from a shelf, the air growing colder with each subtle motion. I ventured to the shoreline, where the fog pressed down so heavily that I could barely see a few meters ahead. Reflections on the lake showed figures standing just beneath the surface, pale, shadowy, watching. I realized with a chill that the lake wasn't passive. It was sentient, recording and feeding on fear, its surface a mirror of the unseen horrors lurking within the fog. The realization hit me. The cabin and Misty Lake weren't just dangerous, they were intelligent. Every movement, every hesitation I made was noted, used against me. I wasn't simply staying in a cabin. I was becoming a part of the lake's living nightmare. By the fifth night, fear had taken full control. The fog pressed against the cabin walls like a living entity, and every sound, a branch snapping, a distant splash, or the wind brushing through the trees, felt deliberate. Shadows moved along the floorboards inside the cabin, flickering just beyond the corners of my vision, stretching unnaturally as though alive. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured along the narrow dock jutting into the lake. The water's surface was still, yet I saw faint, shifting silhouettes beneath, faces and figures that twisted unnaturally, watching me with hollow eyes. A whisper carried across the water, calling my name in a tone both familiar and distorted. I realized then that Misty Lake wasn't merely haunted. The cabin and the surrounding waters were a single, sentient trap, patient and intelligent, feeding off the terror it induced. Each night, the fog, the whispers, and the shadows learned more about me, anticipating my fear, molding it, until I felt trapped both physically and mentally. The sixth night, I tried to record everything with my camera, hoping for evidence or means to understand the terror. But nothing appeared. The shadows, the figures, the whispers, all were invisible to technology, yet tangible to my senses. Every creak of the cabin floor, every subtle flicker of light seemed orchestrated, meant to unnerve, disorient, and trap me. I ventured toward the forest edge, and the fog thickened as if aware of my movement. Shapes emerged briefly, tall, thin, featureless forms, standing perfectly still and then vanishing before I could approach. The whispers grew louder, repeating my name, mimicking my voice in ways that made my skin crawl. I understood then that Misty Lake and the cabin were not just dangerous. They were intelligent predators, waiting decades for the right person to stumble into their grasp. Every sound, every hesitation, every fearful glance was fed upon, recorded, and reflected back, ensuring that the terror only grew with each passing night. By the seventh night, the fog had become suffocating, pressing against the cabin windows so heavily I could barely see outside. Every creak, every whisper, every subtle movement in the trees felt calculated, purposeful, and meant to terrify. Shadows now moved independently of light, stretching unnaturally along walls and floors, slithering toward me in silent patience. I decided to explore deeper into the woods, despite my fear. The forest seemed alive, trees bending subtly as I passed, shapes flitting between trunks, watching me with hollow, glowing eyes. At one point, I glimpsed a small, pale figure standing at the water's edge, frozen yet impossibly aware of my every movement. The lake reflected distorted shapes that shouldn't exist, faces, hands, and figures that twisted reality itself. Misty Lake and the cabin were no longer just a trap. They were hunters, aware of me, feeding on every tremor of fear, every heartbeat, and every hesitation. I realized I wasn't visiting the lake. I was being observed, studied, and drawn deeper into its living nightmare. The eighth night, I tried to confront the terror directly, stepping onto the dock and shouting into the fog, demanding it show itself. The lake responded, not with sound, but with movement beneath the surface. Dark, shifting shapes circling slowly, as though aware of my presence. The fog thickened and swirled unnaturally, forming humanoid silhouettes that flickered in and out, disappearing when I focused on them directly. Inside the cabin, shadows elongated along the walls, stretching like living tendrils, while faint whispers layered my own voice over distorted words I couldn't comprehend. I realized the cabin wasn't just a structure, and the lake wasn't just water. They were one sentient force, patient and intelligent, recording every movement, every fear, every heartbeat. I felt my sanity fray. Every step, every glance outside, every shadow inside was a reminder that Misty Lake wasn't simply haunted. It was alive, aware, and unyielding, and I had become part of its prey. By the ninth night, I was trapped in a waking nightmare. The fog pressed so heavily that the trees seemed to lean toward me, their branches like skeletal hands reaching to grasp. Shadows no longer lingered. They followed, stretched and shifted, moving in ways that defied reality. Whispers echoed, not only around me but inside my head, repeating fears I hadn't spoken aloud, layering them into a suffocating chorus of dread. I stumbled along the dock, and the lake's surface reflected not my own form, but twisted, distorted versions of myself. Each one reaching, screaming silently, eyes hollow and black. I realized the cabin and lake weren't merely haunted, they were alive, feeding on my fear, reshaping reality, and claiming pieces of me. Every night they had learned more about me, anticipating my movements, predicting my panic. Misty Lake didn't just watch, it hunted, tested, and fed, ensuring that any who ventured near would never leave untouched by its living nightmare. I was becoming part of its eternal record of terror. The 10th night, I knew escape was my only chance. I ran through the fog-laden forest, the lake beside me shifting and rippling unnaturally, dark shapes moving beneath the surface as though tracking my every step. The whispers grew louder, mimicking my own voice, layering commands and threats over my thoughts, guiding me deeper into terror. I finally reached my car at dawn, breathless and trembling. Behind me, Misty Lake lay still, fog dissipating, but I could feel its presence, patient and eternal. The cabin and the lake had not released me. They had left fragments of themselves inside my mind, shadows that followed me, whispers that echoed in silence. Even now, years later, I can feel eyes on me in quiet rooms, hear faint voices in empty streets, and sense shapes lingering just beyond vision. Misty Lake and its forgotten cabin never forget. They wait, and they will claim again. The shadows of Canada's small towns are deeper than most dare to imagine. From abandoned cabins by misty lakes, to silent houses learning every fear, to forests that watch and wait, these stories are proof that terror often hides in the quiet corners of our world. The victims were ordinary people, yet they encountered horrors that lingered, reshaping reality and haunting